Hey there, Laker fans. Welcome to another episode of Radio KBE. As always, if you can like and subscribe, I'd appreciate it. The channel is continuing to grow and you guys continue to be awesome. For this episode, I wanted to talk about something that's been showing up in a lot of writers' analysis and just sort of stuff that I've been seeing on the timeline and from different folks that are writing about the Lakers and just kind of what their offseason moves are going to be. And it's specifically been about, what the Lakers should do or what the next steps forward are if the Lakers decide to hold on to Russell Westbrook, and just kind of what's supposed to go on. And so you guys have seen the other videos that I've done. It's still too early. We don't know what direction anything is going to go in. If he gets moved, it's going to be something that happens very fast. I don't think it's going to be something that we'll know about well in advance. Once he opts in, he's going to get traded. It's sort of like the Montrezl Harrell thing, if you remember. When they had the deal lined up for Montrezl Harrell, we were all waiting to see if he would opt in, and it just that if the front office knows that he's going to opt in, they're just going to trade him. There's no ransom or standoff happening with this situation. I don't think he's going to pass up his money, and I don't believe he has a no trade clause anyways. But anyways, aside from all that sort of stuff, one of the things that I've noticed a lot of people writing about or just kind of talking about is this idea of optimizing Russ and optimizing the offense and the defense and optimizing the roster and stuff like that for Russ. And so the reason why I wanted to kind of discuss this today was because it seems like the message that's being put out there is that you have to make Russ work. And in all honesty, I think that's the wrong way to go about it if he's on this team. I don't think it's about making Russ work. I think it's about fitting Russ into what you're trying to do. Assuming his strengths fit into what you're trying to do. And I think that is the way that I've been trying to look at what Darvin Ham's offense is going to be, what Darvin Ham's defense is going to be. I think a lot of times when we watch basketball games and when we try to analyze basketball, and a lot of analysts do this, it's always looking at the player, looking at them, and then almost in an NBA 2K fashion, or because of the advance of analytics and stuff like that, and just the growth of it and how people evaluate players and stuff like that. I think people look at players and they go and they say, okay, what does this player do really well? And what do we need to put around this player for that player to be successful? And I think specifically with Russ, the issue is that though his salary is incredibly high, he shouldn't be looked at that way. I think you look at LeBron James that way, and I think you look at Anthony Davis that way. But now with a new coach on this team, with a different philosophy from what Vogel originally did, I would imagine, I don't think you should look at Russ in that manner. And one of the examples that I have of something like that, and then the example I consistently look at it, is the team that Darvin Ham came from. Look at what Milwaukee did. Before they made the trade for Drew, they wanted a ball handling guard who could score with some ability, and Drew is capable of doing that, and he's a big guard. He plays a big guard. He's an outstanding defender. But they didn't bring him in to completely change how they play their offense. They knew how they were going to play their offense. It's going to run through Giannis. It's going to run through Chris Middleton. And Drew's job is to defend and facilitate, and occasionally when his number gets called, to run pick and roll or get a post-up matchup to punish a small guard or something like that. He'll get his opportunities to do that. And that's the part, that's the way that I envision if Russ is on this roster. That's the way that the Lakers should approach it. And I think the strange part has been that that's not the way folks are talking about it. A lot of folks are talking about Russ and just kind of how the Lakers are supposed to make him work is to make that the focal point. Russ, LeBron's a malleable player. Like, he can play with anybody in any style. There will be times where the ball should be in his hands and stuff like that. Anthony Davis, it's a little bit different with him because he's not as, obviously he's not LeBron, so he's not able to play in a whole bunch of different styles. So you have to tailor your offense a little bit for a guy like him. But Russ is not at this point in his career where you should be featuring an entire roster on him. And I don't want to say that they're wrong, but I don't think it's the right approach. I don't think it's the right approach to, and I mentioned this last season too as well. Last season, bringing Russ on, I don't think they brought Russ on. I don't think this front office brought Russ on board for the purpose of like featuring him the way that we feature LeBron or featuring him the way that we use Anthony Davis. Not only do we not do that, but when we did do that, it was without LeBron and Anthony Davis too as well. So it was like last season, the reason why we had to run certain lineups and stuff like that is because it was almost because as if like we had no other options, so we had to go all in on Russ. And because the roster construction was built so poorly, it just wasn't going to happen. And on top of that, we had a coach in Frank Vogel who prioritized his lineup choices in a way that didn't actually suit Russ's strengths. So a lot of times people, like the common thing that people have consistently said is, well, you can't play Russ with another non-shooter. Well, if you actually go back and you look at the data, and if you actually go back and you look at the tape, Russ playing next to another big man wasn't actually the issue. It just depended on who the big man was. When it was Anthony Davis, he was fine. The offense was fine. When it was Dwight Howard, if you remember towards the end of the season when Anthony Davis was ruled out again, it was fine. When it's next to LeBron James, he's also okay. But there's obviously other parts of the game that suffer. The times where it ended up not being was definitely not successful is when we were playing Russ, Anthony Davis, or Russ and Dwight, and then putting non-shooters on the floor, and that was compounding an issue. You were playing guys who were supposed to be strong defenders, but were terrible scorers, and then you were pairing them with a guy whose best ability was to get to the rim and then create shooting opportunities for the guys that would be left open. And it was just a snowball. And I thought last season, because of the injuries to LeBron and Anthony Davis, we had to try and optimize for Russ. We didn't optimize for him the way that we probably should have. I think a lot of that falls on the front office and their roster construction and just kind of how lazy it was. And also with our coach, who was very apprehensive about playing certain players like Malik Monk, like Austin Reeves, and would favor guys like Avery Bradley, and he wouldn't play guys like Talen Horton-Tucker. There was actually a point, everybody says there's no way you could play Talen and Russ at the same time. There was actually a point in the season where we were playing them together, and there was a point where they were actually successful. But the issue was when they were being played together. You couldn't play Russ, Talen, and LeBron together because now you had 30 ball dominant guys who couldn't necessarily. LeBron could obviously space, but neither Talen nor Russ could space for LeBron. And then you were also throwing them next to Anthony Davis, another guy who had subpar shooting efforts. So like now it just became too easy to play against. And so while the conversation last season will be about Russ's performance, regardless of what his box score was and whatever it is, and his salary is extremely large, the Lakers shouldn't be optimizing for Russ, in my opinion. I don't even think Russ wants the offense to be optimized for him. There's nothing that I think I've seen in the way that he's responded to questions in the interviews where he's talked about saying, well, you guys haven't built this team around me for me to be successful. I think the fact that hasn't been a point of discussion, that the fact that he hasn't turned around and said that, obviously he said certain things, but like after Vogel's been gone, hearing Austin Reeves say what he's had to say about, players basically, young players playing basically, and this is me paraphrasing, this isn't exactly what he said, but saying like they had to play being concerned that they would get pulled if they made a mistake. Hearing LeBron in his exit interview say that the Lakers kept using different closing lineups. There was no consistency to them. I interpreted both of those things as them talking about Vogel. And while the theme of this entire season has been Russ, I mean, no player is going to throw their coach under the bus, but there's been times where our players have commended the opposing coach on the other side. Kent Bazemore has mentioned to some degree that the roster wasn't bought into Frank Vogel. These are all small things. And the big quote that everybody shared from the exit interview was when Russ said, everybody says, let Russ be Russ. But we know that's not true, if I remember the quote correctly. A lot of people took that as Russ saying that about LeBron and Anthony Davis. Like those two guys were the guys that were saying that. But when you think about it in hindsight, both those two players missed a ton of games, right? And when Russ was playing and it was only Anthony Davis played the 5. And when Russ was playing and Anthony Davis was out, like LeBron was willing to play the 5. So I never understood that quote being directed at LeBron and Anthony Davis, because for me it was always, well, he played with them, so he knows that they did small sacrifice. Like Melo played the 5, like they did things to make, help make the lineups work. And when I thought about it more and more, I thought to myself, I think Russ was talking about Vogel. I think Russ, when he said that, let Russ be Russ, play the way that he wants to play, or play to his strengths, what he's good at, I think he was talking about the coach not allowing him to do that. Because there were so many possessions where Russ would just come down and just iso ball, and he would do post-ups, and it made no sense. And I can't imagine that LeBron and Anthony Davis and people were sitting by the side and just thinking to themselves, yeah, let me just go ahead and just let him do whatever he wants. Like that doesn't make sense. But the thing I could see happening is if that is what the play call was. If the Lakers weren't running any sets, any action, like they were hardly running pick and roll. We've been one of the worst pick and roll teams by volume, in terms of volume, in Vogel's entire tenure. We don't run it. But that's one of Russ's strengths, not like scoring out of the pick and roll, but his ability to make reads out of the pick and roll, set up shooters, attack the rim, find the lob guy. But we made it so easy. When we played LeBron at the 5, LeBron wouldn't roll to the rim. That's just because he's 6'8", 6'9". He's going to get beat up. He's got to make plays behind a 7-footer that's trying to chip him on the screen. So he would pop out for a jumper, or we'd do the same with Melo. It was so predictable. And then the only options would be either you put a wing on Russ for the defense, and you stymie him, and he's at a height disadvantage, at a strength disadvantage against those guys, and he can't bully his way to the rim, or he passes out to a shooter that's not really open because they know that Russ is trying to find the open shooter, or that the guy's not a shooter. Like it's, and no offense to these players, it's Stanley Johnson, or it's Avery Bradley, or Talen Horton-Tucker. Like just guys who the shot wasn't there. And so that's like this conversation that's been happening about like optimizing Russ. It's been really confusing for me to read. I don't think the Lakers have to do that. I think the Lakers have to sit down with the front office has to sit down with Darvin Ham. They have to see what style of basketball they have to play. They have to see if Russ fits into it at that salary cap number, which in most cases he doesn't. And then they have to move on from there. If Russ was originally brought onto this team to be a playmaker, to be a facilitator, how much did we use him in that role last season? It felt like he was used more as a scorer. He was expected to be, especially with Anthony Davis and LeBron out, you're expecting him to be a 25-a-night guy and then also distribute 10 assists. But we were putting him in ISO situations, and as soon as the opposing team put a 6'7" wing on him, because the first 1 or 2 possessions of the game he'd bully his man to the rim, it was over. It was done. But then you watch the games where, Russ, the home game that we had against Boston, and you see him be quiet in the first half. and you see him just kind of play his role, facilitate, not do anything crazy, picks up Jason Tatum in the mid-range areas to keep him away from the rim, stuff like that. And then he explodes in the third quarter when Boston adjusts its coverages to make sure that Anthony Davis doesn't get easy looks. Russ takes off because he's able to make reads out of pick and roll and stuff like that. And that's the part that I think Laker fans are getting a little confused. I think that's like, I'm not all Laker fans. I think a good chunk of the Laker fans. I think this also happens because writers and people in the media present it this way. It's being presented like we have to build this thing around Russ, and we have to make Russ work. I don't think you have to make Russ work. I think that's a wrong way to look at it. The way we have to look at it is, how do we make Darvin Ham's system work? And does Russ fit into that system? Are there strengths that Russ has that work within Darvin Ham's system? And is it enough to offset whatever his weaknesses are? And I think that's the right way to think of it. So, like, the title of this episode has been Optimizing Russ. And I don't think the Lakers have to do that. I think Russ, for his athletic wane, his declining athleticism, missed layups, that sort of stuff, like, I understand all that. Like, I don't think there's any confusion about stuff like that. But the thing is, that shouldn't be the way that we go about doing stuff. Even if Russ is on this roster, you shouldn't be optimizing for Russ. You should be optimizing for what works. So what works? Does spreading the floor with shooters next to Russ and LeBron and AD work? Even if it wasn't Russ, if it was another person, I'll take it. If it was John Wall, if it was Malcolm Brogdon, if it was DJ Augustine, if anybody else was in that position instead of Russ, would you be putting more 3-and-D wings on this roster? If the answer is yes, then that's it. You're not trying to optimize for Russ. You won't need to optimize for the scheme, the philosophy. There are teams that do this really well. The Miami Heat are a great example of a team where Eric Spoelstra has a style of basketball that he wants to play. It's a style of basketball that Miami has found to be successful, next to just what Jimmy Butler does. And they find guys to fit into those like roles, to fit into those schemes. And because of that, when they're not injured or whatever it is, like they continue to be successful. In the 3 years that they've been there, Jimmy and the Heat have made it to the finals and the Eastern Conference Finals twice. That's a big deal. That means that you have some rate of success as long as your guys are healthy. That means that you have a baseline philosophy that works, and you've got players that fit in. Duncan Robinson got paid $18 million because he couldn't miss from 3 in the regular season, but he wasn't getting minutes. And you don't have to look much farther. The Heat are an example in the Eastern Conference. You see the same thing, as I mentioned, with the Milwaukee Bucks. They have a baseline style of play that they want to play. I mean, you see it with the Clippers. You see it with the Suns. You see it with the Utah Jazz. Just a season or two ago, the Utah was the number 1 team in the regular season because they knew how they wanted to play. Ton of volume of threes, funnel the guys defensively into Rudy Gobert. But in the playoffs, obviously, it's different because teams are more hyper-focused. They can expose and break certain things. And I think that's the direction the Lakers have to go in. It's not optimizing for one player. Because if you move Russ and you replace him with a 3-and-D shooter, let's say you replace him with DJ Augustine, somebody still has to attack the rim. Because that's a core part of Darvin Ham's offense. That's a core part of the Bucks' philosophy. Giannis attacks the rim all the time. Drew attacks the rim when it's, when Giannis isn't on the floor. He uses screens and gets to the rim. So you can't just let somebody go and then not replace the purpose in the offense. And so this conversation that's been going on about like optimizing Russ, I think it's the wrong way to have that conversation. I think the conversation has to be, I think the Lakers front office has to really look at what Darvin Ham wants to do, what would make it successful for him to be successful. This is what we did the very first season, and they have to build a roster to those strengths. And that's the way I approach free agency. That's the way I'm approaching this entire process. But we did that for Vogel in the first season, and we won a championship. We got a bunch of three, like, because Braun was going to play point guard, we got Danny Green, we got KCP, we got 2, 3, and D guys next to him. Then we got Anthony Davis. Then we got the rim protector, who is also like a vertical lob threat for LeBron when he drove to the rim, who was also a good screener. Like, we built a team to the style that Frank Vogel wanted, based on just kind of the stuff they wanted. The offense wasn't great when LeBron left, like when he was off the floor, and we had Rajon Rondo on the floor. But again, in the playoffs, things change. It gets a little bit different in the playoffs. And I think the Lakers have to go back to doing that. I think last season was a very good example of what happens when you build a roster that's not to the play style of what the coach wants. And I think the Lakers have to approach it in that manner. I think they have to look at Darvin Ham's philosophy and his style of play and what he thinks is successful, which I think is a successful brand of basketball if you get the right players on the roster, and they have to go that way. So I don't think optimizing Russ is the way that you want to do it. I think acknowledging what his strengths and weaknesses and what kind of schemes he's good in is important, but I don't think that should be the focus. And so that's probably the way that I'll try and promote it this offseason, just kind of how the Lakers should build their roster. But I thought I'd just kind of talk about it because that's been like the next thing, like now that we've got a coach, like everybody's like, oh, now what are we going to do with Russ? And for the flow path that involves keeping Russ, it's been, well, how do we optimize him? I don't think that's the way to do it. I think you want Darvin Ham to go to Russ at the beginning of the season and go to all the players and say, look, this is how we want to play basketball. This will work. Russ, this is what I need you to do. Maybe it's not take jump shots at all. Maybe it's not take layups at the rim. Russ, your first step is still excellent. I watched you blow by Lonzo Ball and Alex Caruso and all these other guys that were on Chicago's perimeter defense and get to the rim for layups or set up your teammates. We need you to keep doing that. Just blow by them. And if you can't finish at the rim or you're having a tough game finishing at the rim, find the shooters. And we'll make sure that we get shooters in the right spots for you to make that. That's the way that it has to go. I don't think it's supposed to be, all right, we need to set up this lineup exactly to be to Russ's strengths. Russ, figure it out. And I think that's what a lot of last season was. I think a lot of last season was, we're going to throw this lineup out there, figure it out. And so I'll be interested to see just kind of what direction it goes in. But I just thought I'd talk about it. I think Laker fans, that's how I'll look at it, and that's how I'll encourage Laker fans to look at it. We want to be bought into Darvin Ham's philosophy. We don't want to be optimizing just for specific players. LeBron can't play full-time point guard. He's made that very clear. And next season's going to be incredibly important because he wants to break that scoring record. I'm sure he wants to be healthy. He wants to compete for a title, make a deep playoff run. We can't afford to tax LeBron physically in the regular season like we have the past 2 seasons. Obviously, it's injuries and stuff that has nothing that's his fault, but I think that's a big deal. I think that's going to matter a lot. And whether Russ is on this roster, we'll see what happens. But we're not here to optimize Russ. We have to make sure that we're aware of his strengths and weaknesses, but that shouldn't be the focal point moving forward. The focal point moving forward is how do we get these guys to fit into Darvin Ham's philosophy, if they do. Or if they don't, then we have to consider other avenues. And as always, I'm high on Darvin Ham's philosophy. I think his philosophy will get more if Russ is here, if Taylor Horton-Tucker's here. I think it will get more out of those guys because it'll give them a very clear sense of direction as to what their decision-making should be and just kind of steady action and stuff like that. So appreciate you guys, as always, tuning in to this episode of Radio KBE. If you can share it, you can like it, you can subscribe. I appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one.